"It's cold. It's just the two of us. There's no other choice," said the young Apache woman, trembling. The wind cut through the empty valley like a sharp knife, carrying with it the bitter scent of frost and pine. Snow lay thick across the ground, covering the footprints of those who had passed before, and the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting a pale light that did little to warm the frozen earth. In the middle of this vast white wilderness, a young Apache woman huddled close to a small fire that threatened to burn itself out. Her hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the fear that had settled into her chest. She glanced at her companion, a boy now much older than herself, whose face was pale and drawn. They were alone, completely alone, and survival depended on their courage, wits, and the small fire between them. The woman drew her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Its rough wool scratched her skin, but it was better than nothing. Every part of her body ached from the cold, from days of walking through snowdrifts that reached her knees. Her feet, numb and stiff, made every step a challenge. Her mind replayed the events that had led them here, trying to make sense of how a journey that had begun with hope had turned into a desperate struggle for life. The small band of their people had been scattered by a storm, and now she and this boy were the only ones left together. The thought of the others, of family and friends she might never see again, pressed heavily on her heart. She shivered again, pulling the blanket closer. "It's cold," she whispered, her voice trembling like the thin flames of their fire. Her companion nodded, his eyes wide and anxious. Neither spoke much. Words felt useless against the vast emptiness surrounding them. Snow swirled around the rocks and trees, and the wind carried a low, mournful whistle that seemed to echo the loneliness in her heart. It was a sound she could not ignore, and she felt the ache of isolation deep in her bones. There were no other choices. They had to survive together, or not at all. The woman's eyes wandered to the distant horizon, where the faint shapes of mountains loomed like silent guardians. She remembered her mother's stories of these mountains, stories that spoke of hidden springs, safe caves, and paths that led to warmth and shelter. But now, in the cruel light of reality, those stories seemed distant and almost impossible to find. Every step forward was a battle, every decision a question of life or death. The boy beside her was trembling too, and she realized that courage alone was not enough. They needed careful thinking, knowledge, and sheer determination. She crouched closer to the fire, pressing her hands against the small flames, hoping to draw some strength from them. She thought about the lessons her elders had taught her, the importance of observation, patience, and listening to the land. The snow was thick and cold, but it could also be a guide. Footprints, broken branches, and the subtle smell of the air could show them which way to go, which paths were dangerous, and where water might be hidden. She shared these observations softly with the boy, pointing out faint tracks in the snow, whispering what she had learned from the land over many years. It comforted her to share knowledge, to feel that she could still take care of someone else, even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. Hours passed slowly, each one seeming longer than the last. The sun dipped lower and the temperature dropped even further. Her teeth chattered involuntarily, and she had to shake them free from the stiffness that had taken hold. The boy tried to light another small fire, but the wind was relentless, pushing the sparks away before they could catch. Frustration mixed with fear, and for a moment she felt a surge of hopelessness. But she forced herself to breathe deeply, to calm the rising panic in her chest. Giving in to despair would solve nothing. Survival depended on patience, on careful choices, and on courage, even when the heart screamed to give up. As evening approached, the snow began to fall again, soft at first, then heavier, covering everything in a thick, silent blanket. She wrapped the boy in her blanket and pressed her own body against his for warmth. They whispered little words of encouragement, nothing long or elaborate, just small phrases to remind each other that they were still alive. The cold was not their only enemy. Loneliness and fear threatened to crush their spirits. But together, they created a fragile bubble of hope in the midst of a harsh, unyielding wilderness. She thought about her tribe, about the life they had led before the storm separated them. Memories of laughter, shared meals, and the guidance of elders flowed through her mind. Those memories were bittersweet, reminding her of what had been lost but also giving her strength. Her mother had once told her, even in the coldest winter, the heart can carry warmth. She clung to those words now, repeating them quietly to herself, letting them anchor her mind to hope and resilience. Night fell and darkness pressed against the edges of their small camp. The fire burned lower, casting flickering shadows across the snow. Every sound was magnified. The crunch of distant branches under the weight of snow, the whistle of wind through bare trees, the faint groan of ice under its own weight. She stayed alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of danger, any clue that might guide them to safety. The boy dozed fitfully, shivering in his sleep, and she found herself thinking of her role, of the responsibility she carried. She was not just surviving for herself. She was surviving for him, for the hope that some part of their people might still endure. Hours blended into one another, the cold gnawing at her body, but her mind remained sharp. She reviewed everything she knew, the hidden paths, the signs of wildlife, the small herbs that could warm or soothe, even the snow patterns that might indicate water beneath the surface. Each piece of knowledge was a lifeline, a tool she could use to keep them alive. And yet fear lingered at the edges of her thoughts, whispering that they might not make it, that the wilderness was too vast, too cruel. She forced herself to push those thoughts aside, replacing them with determination and focus. By the time the first faint light of dawn touched the horizon, the young woman and the boy were still huddled together, exhausted but alive. The fire had died to embers, but the warmth of their shared struggle kept them moving. She looked at the boy and saw in his eyes the same mixture of fear and hope that mirrored her own. Together, they were small, fragile beings in a world that seemed vast and merciless. Yet they were still here, still fighting. She knew that the journey ahead would be just as harsh, perhaps harsher, but for now, they had survived the night. In that quiet moment, surrounded by endless snow and the frozen winds, she whispered again, more firmly this time. "It's cold. It's just the two of us. There's no other choice." The words were not just a statement of fact. They were a promise to keep moving, to keep hoping, to keep living. And with that promise, she felt a small spark of courage ignite inside her, a fire that no storm, no cold could extinguish. The young Apache woman knew that the world was not forgiving, that the wilderness demanded strength, wisdom, and resilience, but she also knew something more, that even in the loneliest, coldest moments, hope could endure. And as the pale sun began to rise, casting its weak but steady light over the snow, she felt that for the first time in many hours, perhaps they could find their way home. The morning air was crisp and sharp, cutting into the skin of the young Apache woman as she stood and stretched, testing the stiffness in her limbs. The snow, which had fallen heavily during the night, blanketed the land in an endless sheet of white. Every movement seemed slower, heavier, as though the cold had seeped into her bones and made her body reluctant to obey. She looked down at the boy beside her, who was rubbing his frozen hands together, trying to wake the feeling in them. His face was pale, and his eyes held the same mixture of fear and determination that reflected her own. They had survived the night, but the day ahead promised new challenges, each one demanding careful thought and courage. She studied the surrounding landscape, trying to map a path in her mind. The mountains in the distance rose like silent, ancient guardians, their peaks hidden in clouds. Between them and safety lay valleys filled with snow, rocks slick with ice, and trees stripped bare by the winter wind. The woman knew that moving forward meant leaving the fragile warmth of the fire behind, stepping into a world that was unforgiving and unknown. Yet standing still was not an option. Hunger and exhaustion would only grow worse if they lingered, and the thought of waiting for rescue that might never come filled her with unease. She shook the snow from her blanket and gestured for the boy to follow. Their first steps were slow and careful. Each footfall sank into the snow, leaving prints that would soon be covered by more falling flakes. The boy stumbled once, but she caught him before he fell, holding him steady with a reassuring hand. He looked at her, a faint flicker of gratitude in his eyes, and she smiled, though it was small and tight. "We must move carefully," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Every step matters. We cannot waste our strength.
The boy nodded, trying to match her pace, and together they began a cautious journey toward the distant mountains, their only hope for shelter and safety.
The journey was harder than she had expected. The snow was deep, hiding uneven ground beneath. Each step required effort, and the wind whipped at their faces, biting at exposed skin. The woman's hands and feet were numb despite the blankets and furs she carried. She pressed onward, reminding herself of the knowledge she had learned from her elders, the signs of safe paths, the smell of water beneath ice, and the subtle changes in the wind that could signal danger. Every sense was alert. Every instinct was sharpened by fear and determination. By midday they had walked through a dense stand of trees, their branches heavy with snow. The boy was exhausted, stumbling and dragging his feet. She stopped, placing her hand on his shoulder to steady him. "We need to rest for a moment," she said softly. "Even a few minutes will help us keep going." They found a small hollow, partially sheltered by rocks, and huddled together. She dug into her pack for the little food they had, some dried meat and a small handful of corn, and divided it carefully. The boy ate quickly, while she nibbled slowly, conserving energy. As they ate, she scanned the trees, listening to the wind and the soft crunch of snow, alert for any sign of animals or danger. The pause gave them a chance to talk, to share the fears and memories that had been heavy on their minds during the long night. The boy spoke of his family, of the people he had lost, and she listened quietly, feeling the weight of his grief as if it were her own. In return, she told him stories of her own life, the teachings of her mother, the lessons of her tribe, and the ways she had learned to survive in the land around them. Talking brought comfort, even in the midst of fear. It reminded them that they were not completely alone. They still had each other. After a short rest, they moved on again. The sun was low, and the light was beginning to fade. Shadows stretched across the snow, making the terrain harder to judge. The woman's heart raced with every step, aware that darkness brought new risks. But something pressed on her mind more urgently than the cold: water. She knew that without water, they could not last much longer. Streams and rivers were frozen, and finding a safe source meant careful observation and courage. She scanned the land, noticing subtle changes in snow color and tree growth, signs that might indicate a spring beneath the ice. Hours passed, and their journey grew more difficult. The boy's legs trembled from exhaustion, and she had to support him at times, urging him forward when he faltered. Her own body ached, but she refused to let weakness show. Survival depended on determination, on using knowledge wisely, and on keeping fear from controlling them. She thought of the elders, of the lessons learned around warm fires, of the stories of those who had endured winters harsher than this one. Those memories gave her strength, a quiet courage that she pressed into every step she took. By late afternoon they came upon a narrow valley. A thin stream ran through it, partially frozen, the water still flowing beneath the ice. Relief and hope surged through her chest. "Look," she said to the boy, pointing at the water. "We can drink and rest here for a while. Be careful. Step on the ice where it is strong." They approached slowly, testing the ice with sticks before stepping on it. The boy drank eagerly, and she followed, careful not to slip. The water was cold, but it warmed something inside, a spark of life that had been dimmed by the long, harsh day. After drinking, they sat quietly for a moment. The woman's mind was busy, planning the next steps. They could not stay here too long. Night would come, and the cold would deepen. She knew that even a short rest was dangerous, but it was necessary to regain strength. She wrapped the boy in her blanket and pressed closer to him for warmth, whispering softly to calm him and herself. "We can do this," she said, more to herself than to him. "We must. There is a way forward." The sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. She stood and looked toward the distant peaks, her heart both heavy and hopeful. The valley was beautiful in its silence, but beauty did not keep the cold from biting. Every step forward would test them. Every decision would matter. She needed to find a sheltered place for the night, somewhere the wind would not reach, and where the snow would not bury them. Her eyes scanned the slopes, looking for caves, overhangs, or clusters of trees that might provide protection. As they moved again, a sudden sound made them both freeze. A distant crack echoed through the valley. The breaking of ice, perhaps a tree snapping under the snow. The woman's heart thumped in her chest. She pressed the boy close, signaling him to stay silent. They waited, listening, every nerve alert. Nothing came after the sound, but the reminder of danger was clear. The wilderness was alive and unpredictable. They were small, fragile, and alone, yet they had no choice but to move forward. Hours of careful travel brought them to a small grove sheltered by rocks and tall trees. It was far from perfect, but it was safer than the open valley. She helped the boy lie down on some gathered pine needles and set up a small fire with twigs and branches she had collected. The flames were weak, but they provided warmth, light, and a sense of security. She fed him a little more food and then shared some herself, careful to ration what little they had. Night was falling fast, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. Sitting by the fire, she reflected on the day's journey. They had faced the harshness of the snow, hunger, exhaustion, and fear, yet they had survived. The day had been long, but every step had brought them closer to safety. She thought about the decisions they had made, when to rest, where to find water, how to move carefully, and realized that even in the harshest conditions, knowledge and courage were as vital as warmth and food. She whispered to the boy, "We are doing well. We are surviving. That is all that matters now." As the stars appeared in the clear, cold sky above, she allowed herself a brief moment of hope. The world was harsh and unforgiving, but so were they. Together they could endure the winter, find their way through the snow, and perhaps, eventually, find the safety of their people. The night was long and cold, but she was no longer trembling as she had the night before. The courage within her had grown, fed by experience, determination, and the bond she shared with the boy. They were still alive, and that was the beginning of everything. The next morning, the young Apache woman woke to a world sparkling with frost. The trees were coated in ice, and every branch glittered like 1,000 tiny stars under the pale winter sun. The air was still, almost eerily so, and she felt the weight of silence pressing around them. The boy beside her stirred, rubbing his eyes and shivering from the lingering cold of the night. She pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and whispered softly, "We must keep moving. The day will be long, but each step brings us closer to safety." His nod was slow, but determination glimmered in his tired eyes. Breaking camp was always difficult. The fire had died overnight, leaving only cold ashes, and they had to scrape snow from the ground to find solid footing. The woman gathered their few remaining supplies and checked their food. Only a small amount of dried meat and a few handfuls of corn remained. She divided it carefully, knowing that they would have to ration every bite if they hoped to survive the days ahead. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it, focusing instead on planning the safest route. The mountains loomed closer now, a jagged barrier between them and potential safety. She knew that the path would be steep, treacherous, and exhausting, but there was no other choice. As they began their climb, the snow deepened, and the wind grew sharper. Each step required careful balance, and every misstep could mean injury. The boy stumbled several times, and each time she steadied him, feeling a surge of protectiveness. "Watch your footing," she instructed calmly. "Lean forward slightly and test each step before you move. The snow can hide dangerous drops." Her own feet ached, but she ignored the pain, concentrating on the rhythm of walking, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the signs of stability in the ground beneath them. Hours passed, and fatigue began to weigh heavily on them both. Their pace slowed as the terrain became steeper, rocks and ice making every step perilous. The woman's mind began to wander to the tribe she had lost, the people who had taught her the ways of the land, the songs sung around fires, the stories told by elders. She clung to these memories, letting them give her strength. She shared some of them with the boy as they moved, telling him about the teachings of survival, respect for nature, and the importance of courage. The boy listened, his face lighting up for brief moments with hope. and it reminded her that even small sparks of hope could make a difference in the coldest, loneliest moments. Midday brought new challenges. The wind picked up, blowing snow into their faces, making it hard to see. The woman noticed faint animal tracks in the snow, likely left by deer searching for food. She used the tracks as a guide, hoping they would lead to a more sheltered area or a source of water. "Follow me closely," she instructed. "We cannot afford to get separated." The boy obeyed, trusting her instincts even though his body was exhausted and his mind filled with fear. She felt a responsibility she had never known before, the weight of another life depending on her choices. As they continued, the woman's thoughts returned to the harsh lessons of survival she had learned. Fires could save life, water could not be taken for granted, and caution was necessary at every step. But beyond survival, there was the matter of courage, the courage to move forward despite fear. She had never known such fear, yet she felt it deeply now, gripping her chest with every gust of icy wind. And yet, she also felt something stronger: determination. The knowledge that she could protect the boy, that she could lead them through this wilderness, gave her a strange, fierce strength. By late afternoon, the sun was low, and the temperature dropped quickly. Snow swirled around them, reducing visibility and making the rocks and slopes more treacherous. The boy began to stumble more frequently, his legs weak from the cold and hunger. The woman reached out to steady him each time, guiding him through the difficult patches of terrain. "We must keep our minds clear," she told him, her voice firm but gentle. "Fear will only slow us. Focus on each step, and we will get through this." He nodded again, drawing courage from her words and presence. Suddenly a sharp crack echoed through the mountains, a sound of ice breaking or perhaps a falling branch. The woman froze, scanning the slope above them. She saw the shadow of a small rock slide beginning to tumble down the hill, snow and stones clattering toward them. Without hesitation, she grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him to the side, using her body to shield him as the debris passed. The rocks grazed their boots, but they were unharmed. Her heart pounded from the close call, and she took a moment to catch her breath. "We must always be ready," she whispered. "The land can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous." The boy looked at her with wide eyes, admiration mixed with lingering fear.
After the rock slide, they pressed on more carefully, moving slowly and deliberately.
The woman's mind was alert to every sound, every movement in the snow. The boy occasionally faltered, but she encouraged him, telling him stories of her childhood and the ways her tribe had survived harsh winters before. She spoke of the strength that came from patience, of the courage that grew in the heart when faced with impossible odds. Each word was a small shield against despair, a reminder that even in the coldest, harshest places, hope could exist. Evening arrived, and they needed to find a safe place to rest. The woman scanned the surrounding slopes and spotted a small overhang, partially sheltered by rocks. It was not perfect, but it offered protection from the wind. She helped the boy to it and gathered branches and pine needles to create a small, insulated space. She managed to light a small fire, carefully shielding it from the wind. The boy huddled close to her, his body shaking from exhaustion and cold. She wrapped her blanket around both of them, pressing close to share warmth. "We will rest here," she said softly. "Tomorrow we continue, but tonight we survive." As they warmed themselves by the weak fire, the woman reflected on the day. They had faced physical exhaustion, the threat of danger, and the ever-present fear of the wilderness. Yet, they had also survived, moved forward, and found strength in each other. The bond between them had grown, rooted in trust and shared struggle. She realized that survival was not just about food, water, and warmth. It was about courage, companionship, and the ability to keep hope alive when the world seemed against them. Night fell, and the cold deepened. The fire burned low and shadows danced across the snow-covered rocks. The woman remained vigilant, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind through trees, the distant call of an owl, the subtle shift of ice and snow. Each sound reminded her that the wilderness was alive, full of challenges and lessons. She whispered to the boy, reminding him of the knowledge they carried and the strength they had already shown. "We have made it this far. she said. We can go farther. We must. The boy's eyes grew heavy, and sleep claimed him despite the cold. The woman stayed awake for a while longer, thinking, planning, and holding on to the small fire that kept the darkness at bay. She realized that the journey ahead would test them in ways even harsher than this day. There would be moments of fear, moments of despair, and moments when courage alone would not be enough. But she also knew that they had learned something important. Together, they could face the cold, the danger, and the loneliness. Together, they had a chance to survive. By the time she finally closed her eyes, the stars above sparkled brilliantly, and the mountains stood silently around them. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The day had been filled with challenges, but they had met them, step by step, decision by decision. She whispered one final promise to herself and the boy. No matter what comes, we will survive. We have the strength, and we have each other. The fire crackled faintly, a small but steadfast symbol of hope in the vast, frozen wilderness. The next morning, a heavy silence hung over the mountains. The young Apache woman woke to find the sky gray, thick clouds blocking the pale sunlight. The snow had fallen again overnight, adding another layer of weight to the already treacherous landscape. The wind howled through the trees like a living creature, relentless and cold. She pressed her blanket tighter around the boy, who stirred weakly beside her, shivering from both cold and fatigue. She could feel his tiny frame trembling, and it made her own chest tighten with worry. Today, more than ever, the world seemed determined to test them. Breaking camp was a slow and exhausting task. The snow had hardened in places, forming slippery patches that made every step dangerous. Her feet were sore, her fingers stiff and numb, despite the blankets and furs she had wrapped around them. The boy's legs shook with exhaustion, and he stumbled frequently, forcing her to pause and help him regain balance. Each misstep reminded her of how fragile their lives were, how easily one wrong move could lead to disaster. She could not let fear control her, but it was difficult to push it away when the world itself seemed so merciless. They continued their climb toward the distant mountains, their eyes searching for signs of shelter. The snow was deep and unyielding, and the wind cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. At times, she had to lead the boy hand in hand, using her own strength to guide him across icy rocks and steep inclines. Hunger gnawed at both of them, their small portions of food from the day before long gone. She felt the empty ache in her stomach, but forced herself to ignore it, focusing instead on the path ahead. Survival depended on moving forward, even when every fiber of the body screamed for rest. Hours passed with little change in the landscape. The gray clouds above pressed down like a weight, and the wind never stopped. Every sound, the groan of ice, the rustle of branches, the distant cry of a bird, felt amplified, reminding her that the mountains were alive with danger. The boy's steps grew slower, and she noticed his eyes glazing with exhaustion.
We must find shelter soon, she whispered, urgency in her voice.
Keep moving, little one. Just a little further and we can rest. He nodded weakly, leaning on her as they climbed together, both of them growing weary with each passing minute. Then, without warning, disaster struck. A sudden gust of wind swept across the slope, stronger than any she had felt before. Loose snow and small rocks tumbled down the hill, and the boy slipped on an icy patch. She lunged forward, catching him just in time, but the sudden effort sent her own body tumbling down a small slope. She hit the ground hard, pain radiating through her side, and a sharp ache shot through her leg. The boy scrambled to her side, his face pale with fear. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. She forced a small nod, ignoring the pain as best she could. "Yes, we must keep moving," she said, though every word cost her strength. The accident left them both shaken. The woman's body ached, and she could feel the cold, deep in her bones. But she could not let despair take over. They had come too far to give up now. She helped the boy to his feet, supporting his weight as they continued their climb. Every step was careful, deliberate, as she tested the ground before moving. Her mind focused on survival, calculating each movement, each decision. She thought about what her elders had taught her, about resilience, patience, and courage, and drew strength from those lessons. Hours later, they reached a small ridge that offered a slight shelter from the wind. It was not much, just a shallow depression in the snow with a few overhanging rocks. But it would have to do. She helped the boy lie down on the ground, cushioning him with branches and pine needles. She tried to start a small fire, but the wind was relentless, extinguishing every spark. Frustration and fear began to creep into her thoughts. The boy looked at her shivering and exhausted, and she felt a pang of helplessness. She had always believed that knowledge, courage, and determination could overcome any challenge, but now the wilderness seemed determined to prove her wrong. As night approached, the cold became unbearable. Her hands were numb, her face stung from the wind, and she could feel her energy draining with every movement. She pressed close to the boy, wrapping her blanket around both of them, whispering words of comfort to keep their spirits alive. "We have made it this far," she said softly. "Tomorrow will be better. We must survive the night." Her voice was calm, but inside her heart raced with worry. The mountains were silent, but the danger of frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion loomed larger than ever. Hours passed slowly. Every sound in the night seemed amplified. The groan of ice, the rustle of wind through the trees, the distant howl of an animal. Fear and loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, but she clung to the small spark of hope that had carried them this far. She thought about her family, about the tribe she had lost, and about the lessons they had taught her. Memories of warmth, laughter, and guidance flickered in her mind, reminding her that even in the coldest, darkest moments, strength could be found within. Suddenly, the boy stirred, his face pale and lips trembling. He whispered that his leg hurt from the fall earlier, and the woman immediately examined him. There was no serious injury, but he was weak and exhausted, barely able to stand. Panic threatened to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. They could not afford fear to control them now. She carefully helped him drink some water and eat a few small crumbs of dried meat, conserving energy for what little remained. Her own body ached. Hunger gnawed at her, but she ignored it, focusing all her energy on keeping the boy alive. Throughout the night, she remained vigilant. The wind never stopped, and the snow continued to fall, piling higher around their small shelter. The mind wandered to the days ahead. What if they could not find safety? What if the mountains proved too harsh? Yet amidst the fear, a quiet determination rose within her. She remembered the words of her mother. Even in the darkest winter, the heart can carry warmth. She repeated those words to herself, letting them steady her mind and spirit. Morning finally came, pale and gray. The snow had grown deeper, making every movement more difficult. The woman and the boy were exhausted beyond measure, but they had survived the night. The woman's mind raced with decisions. The path ahead was uncertain, the mountains steep, and the snow treacherous. Yet she could not remain where they were. They needed shelter, warmth, and safety. She helped the boy to his feet, supporting him as they began to climb once more. Each step was painful, slow, and deliberate. Her own body cried out in exhaustion, but she refused to give in. Survival demanded courage, patience, and strength, even when the body threatened to fail. By midday, the situation grew desperate. The boy's energy faltered, his small legs shaking violently, and the woman realized they could not continue at the pace they had been keeping. She searched desperately for any sign of shelter or safety, a cave, a fallen tree, or even a natural overhang that could protect them from the wind. Hours passed, the cold pressing against them like a living thing, yet she refused to stop. The boy's faith in her gave her strength, and she drew courage from the bond they shared. They had survived this far. They could survive farther still. Finally, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, she spotted what appeared to be a small natural cave, partially hidden by snow and rock. Relief surged through her chest, and she guided the boy carefully toward it. They settled inside, pressing together for warmth, and attempting to light a small fire with the last of their kindling. The flames flickered weakly but provided a small measure of hope against the harsh winter night. Exhausted, they huddled together, drawing strength from each other's presence. In that moment, the woman realized something profound. The journey had been filled with fear, exhaustion, and near disasters, yet they had endured. Their survival was not just about knowledge or courage. It was about hope, resilience, and the bond between them. Even in the lowest, coldest moments, they had found the strength to keep moving forward.
She whispered to the boy, "We are strong."
We are alive. We will make it through. He nodded weakly, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet a flicker of trust and hope shone within them. Night fell again, but the woman no longer felt the same fear as before. She knew the dangers had not ended, that challenges awaited them still, but she also knew that together they could survive anything. They had endured the harshest cold, the relentless wind, and the exhaustion of the journey. They had faced danger and still moved forward. In the quiet of the mountain, she allowed herself a small spark of hope, knowing that survival was not just a matter of skill, it was a matter of courage, perseverance, and heart. The sun rose slowly over the mountains, casting a weak but steady light across the snow. The young Apache woman stirred, feeling the cold still biting at her skin, but a sense of determination filled her chest. The boy beside her was still asleep, his small body huddled close to hers for warmth. She watched him quietly, noting the way he breathed steadily, a small sign that he was alive and surviving. Last night had been one of the hardest of their journey, filled with fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty, but somehow they had endured. Somehow they were still here. She carefully roused the boy, whispering softly, "It is morning. We must keep going. Today, we may find safety." His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the weak sunlight. He looked tired, but there was a flicker of hope in his gaze. Together they prepared to move again. The woman gathered what little supplies remained, checking their dried meat and corn. The journey ahead was still dangerous, but they had survived the harshest parts of the mountains so far. Survival, she realized, was not only about avoiding danger, it was about determination, careful planning, and courage, and they had all three. Their first steps of the day were slow. The snow was still deep, and the wind carried a sharp chill. The boy stumbled a few times, and she steadied him, taking care not to rush. "Step carefully," she instructed, her voice firm but gentle. "Every step is important. We will make it together." He nodded, trusting her completely. Each movement forward felt heavier than the last, yet with every step, they grew stronger. The fear and despair of the past days were still there, but courage had begun to take root in its place. As they climbed higher, the landscape slowly began to change. The slopes became less steep, and the snow, though still deep, was easier to navigate. Small patches of trees offered some shelter from the wind, and distant sounds of running water reached their ears. The woman's heart lifted with hope. "Listen," she said, pointing toward the faint sound of water. "There may be a stream nearby. Water will give us strength to continue." The boy's eyes brightened, and he quickened his pace slightly, encouraged by the possibility of relief from thirst and hunger. After careful searching, they found a narrow stream running between rocks, the water partially frozen but flowing enough to drink safely. They knelt beside it, breaking through the thin ice and drinking deeply. The cold water burned briefly as it touched their lips, but it revived them, giving their bodies a new surge of energy. She helped the boy refill a small container she had saved for this purpose, and they ate a small portion of food to restore their strength. Sitting by the stream, the woman felt a sense of accomplishment. They had survived the harshest part of the mountains, and the path ahead, though still challenging, seemed possible. Refreshed, they continued their journey. The woman noticed subtle signs of civilization in the distance. A small trail, a group of smoke rising faintly above the trees, perhaps from a distant camp or settlement. Her heart leapt with cautious hope. Could there be others nearby? People who could help them, food they could share, shelter from the cold? She remained vigilant, moving carefully with the boy beside her. But the thought of human presence brought a spark of optimism that she had not felt in days.
Hours passed as they descended gently toward the valley below.
The boy's steps grew steadier, and even his smiles returned, small but genuine, breaking the tension that had filled the journey for so long. She encouraged him with gentle words, reminding him of how far they had come, how strong they were, and how they had survived when so much of the world seemed against them. "You have been brave," she told him. "We have been brave together. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is moving forward despite fear." The boy looked at her with admiration, a quiet pride in his eyes that made her chest swell with a mixture of relief and affection. By late afternoon they reached a small clearing. Smoke rose gently from a distant settlement, and she realized with cautious joy that they were not alone. Their hearts lifted, hope filling the cold spaces of exhaustion and fear. She guided the boy toward the settlement carefully, making sure to keep to the safer paths and avoid any hidden dangers in the snow. Each step closer felt lighter, the weight of their long journey beginning to lift. The thought of human contact, warmth, and food kept them moving, giving their tired bodies the strength to continue. As they approached, a group of people noticed them from the edge of the settlement. They were greeted with concern and kindness, offered blankets and warm drinks. The boy clung to the woman, relieved but still wary, and she allowed herself a brief smile of gratitude. The firelight and warmth of the settlement were almost magical after the bitter cold of the mountains. People tended to their needs carefully, offering food, water, and shelter. For the first time in days, they could rest without fear of the elements. While the boy slept, recovering from exhaustion, the woman sat quietly by the fire. She reflected on their journey, the challenges they had faced, and the courage they had discovered within themselves. She thought of the nights spent huddled in the snow, the dangers of the rock slides and icy slopes, the hunger and exhaustion, and the moments of despair that had tested them so deeply. And yet, they had endured. She realized that survival was not just about physical strength. It was about hope, patience, resilience, and the connection between them. As evening settled over the settlement, the woman felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had led the boy through the mountains, protected him from danger, and given him hope when despair threatened. She knew that the journey had changed them both, instilling a strength that would last for a lifetime. The mountains had been harsh, the cold merciless, and the journey exhausting, yet they had survived together. That survival, she realized, was a triumph in itself. The boy awoke, refreshed and smiling, and she welcomed him with gentle words. They shared a warm meal together, eating slowly and savoring the taste of safety and nourishment. She told him stories of their journey, not just the hardships, but also the courage, the decisions, and the strength they had discovered within themselves. He listened intently, eyes wide, as if seeing the journey anew through her words. Together they laughed quietly at small memories, and the weight of fear and despair began to lift from their hearts. Night fell, and the woman stepped outside for a moment, looking at the mountains that had tested them so deeply. The peaks were now softened by the moonlight, no longer threatening but silent witnesses to their endurance. She thought of her people, of the tribes she had been separated from, and felt a renewed sense of connection. Though they had been alone, lost in the wilderness, the lessons of survival, courage, and hope had carried them through. She whispered quietly to herself, "We are alive. We have endured. We are stronger than we knew." The boy joined her outside, and they stood together for a moment, looking at the stars that shone clearly in the cold night sky. The woman felt the bond between them, strengthened by the journey, unbroken by fear or exhaustion. She knew that the world would continue to test them, but the courage they had discovered in themselves would remain, guiding them through future challenges. She took the boy's hand, and he held it firmly, a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. As the night deepened, the warmth of the fire and the settlement enveloped them. The woman allowed herself to rest, feeling the exhaustion of days spent in the wilderness begin to fade. She knew that the journey had changed her, teaching lessons she would carry for the rest of her life. Strength, courage, hope, and the power of connection were more valuable than anything else. The boy slept soundly beside her, safe at last, and she watched over him, grateful for the life they had preserved together. By morning, the settlement was alive with activity, people moving and speaking, the warmth of human presence surrounding them. The woman and the boy had survived the mountains, the cold, and the dangers of the wilderness. They were safe, nourished, and stronger than they had ever imagined. She reflected on the journey, not just the hardships, but also the triumphs, the courage, and the hope that had carried them through. Life was precious, and survival was a gift that required patience, wisdom, and heart. As they prepared to rest for the day, the woman spoke quietly to the boy. "Remember this journey," she said gently. "Remember the cold, the snow, and the fear. But also remember the courage, the hope, and the strength we discovered in ourselves. The world may test us, but we have the power to endure." He nodded, understanding more than words could express. Together they had survived the impossible, and together they would face whatever the future held. The young Apache woman looked once more at the mountains, now distant and quiet, and felt a deep sense of peace. They had endured the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the danger. They had survived because of courage, determination, and the bond they shared. The journey had been harsh, but it had also taught them lessons that would remain forever. And for the first time in many days, she allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for life, for joy, and for the strength to continue forward. In the warmth of the settlement, with the boy safe and smiling beside her, she realized that they had not just survived, they had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The mountains had tested them, but they had endured. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, illuminating the snow and trees with gentle light, she knew that the future was theirs to face together.